If you're listening to this, chances are you're as screwed as I am. Or you're somewhere safe, wondering how the world fell apart so quickly. Either way, I've got time, so I'll tell you everything. First, I'd like to introduce myself. My name's Liam. I'm 23. I used to work a dead-end retail job and was a die-hard zombie fan. Yeah, one of those nerds who spends hours arguing online about whether slow zombies or fast zombies would be better in an apocalypse. I've watched every zombie movie, read every book, and even wrote fanfiction once. I thought I knew how it'd go if the world ever went to hell. I didn't. This isn't like the movies. Not even close. There's no clear patient zero, no heroic scientist working on a cure, no ragtag group of survivors banding together to rebuild. It's worse. Way worse. It all started with plants. Or fungi. I don't remember. Before everything went to hell, life was fine. Not great, but fine. I'd wake up every day around 9 AM because my retail shift started at 11. My job sucked. Stacking shelves, cleaning up spills, dealing with rude customers. But it paid the bills. Barely. My apartment wasn't much, just a one-bedroom with leaky pipes and a fridge that made this awful humming noise. But it was home. I'd come back from work, crack open a beer, and binge whatever zombie movie or show was trending. I had a routine, you know. It wasn't exciting, but it was mine. I spent a lot of time online, mostly on forums and subreddits dedicated to zombie lore. I loved the debates. Could a zombie outbreak happen? What would be the best weapon? Which city would fall first? I was that guy who had it all planned out. My apocalypse survival kit was a mishmash of knives, canned food, and first aid supplies crammed into a duffel bag under my bed. It was a half joke, half serious preparation because, deep down, I wanted it to happen. Not in a people dying is fun kind of way, but in a finally something interesting kind of way. The first time I heard about the bloom, it was a random post on Reddit. Some guy uploaded blurry photos of these weird orange groves covering trees in a rainforest. The post didn't get much attention, just a handful of comments saying it looked like a bad case of fungal overgrowth. A few weeks later, it showed up in the news. Scientists were baffled by how fast it was spreading. They said it wasn't like any fungus they'd seen before. It thrived in heat, consumed entire ecosystems, and released spores that hung in the air like dust. I remember watching a segment on it during my lunch break at work. The anchors sounded concerned, but not panicked. It was happening far away in some remote part of the world, so who cared? The first human cases popped up about a month later. That's when things got weird. The news showed footage of people in small villages near the outbreak zones acting strange. They moved sluggishly at first, then with sudden violent bursts of energy. Their skin looked pale, almost translucent, with patches of bright orange spreading across their arms and necks. Officials called it a localized health crisis and assured everyone it was under control. But online, people were freaking out. Threads were dissecting every frame of footage, claiming it was the start of something big. Others laughed it off, saying it was just another overhyped virus like SARS or Ebola. Me? I was skeptical and a little excited. This was the kind of thing I'd spend years obsessing over. I stayed up late reading every article, watching every video. I even joked with my co-workers about it. "You ready for the zombie apocalypse?" I'd ask, grinning like an idiot. They'd roll their eyes and tell me to get back to work. I didn't care. For once, my useless knowledge about fictional plagues felt relevant. But as the weeks went by, the news got darker. The localized health crisis wasn't so localized anymore. Cases started popping up in other countries, places far from the original outbreak. Entire towns were going silent. The footage became harder to watch. Hospitals overflowing, soldiers patrolling empty streets, people with orange fungal patches covering their faces and arms, screaming and clawing at anyone nearby. The anchors stopped smiling. They didn't say it outright, but you could tell they were scared. I tried to keep my routine going. Wake up, work, do online stuff and sleep. But it got harder to ignore the growing sense of dread. Customers at the store started stocking up on canned foods and bottled water. Some whispered about getting out of town before it was too late. Others were skeptical, saying it was all media hype. I didn't know what to think. Part of me still wanted to believe it wasn't real, that it couldn't happen here. But another part of me, the part that spent hours debating survival strategies online, started to panic. Then, one day, the panic became real. It was a Friday afternoon when the first infected person showed up in my town. Her name was Mrs. Dillard, I think. She was a sweet old lady who always baked cookies for the neighborhood kids. According to her neighbors, she'd been feeling under the weather for a few days, but no one thought much of it. It was flu season, they said, so there was nothing to worry about. But when she wandered into the grocery store where I worked, it was clear something was very, very wrong. She looked off. Her skin was pale and patchy, her movements jerky. But what really got me was her eyes. God, her eyes. They were empty. Not like she was staring through you, but like there was nothing left inside. She collapsed near the cereal aisle, and all hell broke loose. My manager ran to help her, but before he could get close, she lunged at him. She bit right into his arm. I froze. It wasn't until she started changing that I realized how bad it was. Her skin split open, orange tendrils writhing out like vines. She wasn't human anymore. None of us knew what to do. Some people ran, some tried to help. I just stood there like an idiot, staring. That was the last normal day in my town. The entire store was in chaos. My manager, bleeding and groaning on the floor, was turning and turning fast. Those orange tendrils, they grew out of him like weeds, wrapping around his arms and legs, pulsating like they had a heartbeat of their own. His screams were unlike anything I had ever heard. They were the kind that haunt your nightmares. People ran out of the store, knocking over displays and each other, desperately trying to escape. The ones who stayed, the brave, or maybe just the foolish, tried to call for help. But cell service was already getting spotty. The lines were overloaded. Or maybe something worse was happening. I don't know. I didn't leave right away. I couldn't. Part of me was frozen in fear, sure. But another part was curious. I'd seen this kind of thing in movies 100 times, but this was real. Too real. The smell alone, a sickly sweet rot mixed with something sharp and chemical, was enough to make me gag. And the sounds? Wet, tearing noises as the tendrils ripped through clothing and flesh, cracking like dried twigs as bones bent in ways they weren't supposed to. It was horrifying, and I couldn't look away. When I finally snapped out of it, I grabbed my bag and ran. The streets outside were eerily quiet, but not for long. Word spreads fast in a small town, and it wasn't long before the panic set in. Sirens blared in the distance. Cars honked as people tried to flee, clogging up the main roads. I saw someone loading their entire family into the back of a pickup truck, kids crying as their parents shouted at each other. Another guy was throwing bags of groceries into his car like it was the last trip he'd ever make. Maybe it was. I went straight home, locked the door, and turned on the news. The footage was worse than anything I'd seen online. Entire neighborhoods were overrun, streets choked with bodies and fungal growths that glowed faintly in the dark. They showed soldiers in hazmat suits, setting fire to buildings, shooting anyone who came too close, infected or not. The anchors kept repeating the same words. Stay indoors. Do not attempt to leave. Help is on the way. Help wasn't on the way. At least, that's what I thought. The next few hours were a blur. I'd like to say I was brave, that I sprang into action and started preparing for the worst. But the truth? I sat on my couch, clutching a baseball bat I'd grabbed from the closet, and stared at the TV. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends and family. Some were scared, others angry. A few others already talking about barricading themselves in or trying to leave town. I did my best to reassure my parents, who lived in another country, telling them everything was fine for now. What else could I say? By nightfall, the power went out. That's when the real fear set in. My apartment was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from the faint orange glow outside. I peeked through the blinds and saw them. Infected, wandering the streets, their movements jerky and unnatural. Some of them, they were people I knew, neighbors, co-workers, the guy who ran the diner down the street. All gone, replaced by these things. The bloom had taken them, and it was spreading fast. For the first few days, I stayed inside, living off whatever I had in the fridge and pantry. I could hear screams in the distance, gunshots, the occasional explosion. The infected didn't seem to care about day or night. They were always moving, always searching. Sometimes, they'd stop and grow. That's the only way I can describe it. They'd collapse onto the ground, tendrils spreading out from their bodies like roots digging into the pavement. Within hours, those tendrils would sprout into these massive fungal blooms, releasing clouds of spores into the air. I wore a mask whenever I went near a window, but I knew it was probably pointless. After about a week, the government showed up. Or at least, that's what it looked like. Helicopters thundered overhead, their searchlights sweeping over the streets. Trucks rolled in, carrying soldiers in full tactical gear and hazmat suits. They set up checkpoints and barricades at every major intersection, their voices booming through loudspeakers.
This area is under quarantine. Remain indoors. Help is on the way.
For a brief moment, I felt hope. Real tangible hope. Maybe they had a plan. Maybe they could stop this. But that hope didn't last long. The first thing they did was clear out the infected. Not by capturing them, not by trying to treat them. They killed them. All of them. I watched from my window as soldiers marched down my street, firing at anything that moved. The infected didn't stand a chance. Some tried to fight back, their tendrils lashing out. But the soldiers were relentless. The bullets tore through flesh and fungal growths, leaving the streets littered with bodies. At first, I thought they were doing their job, containing the outbreak, protecting the uninfected, and keeping things under control. It even gave me a sense of relief to see order being restored. But that feeling didn't last long. The soldiers weren't here to rescue people. They weren't knocking on doors to hand out supplies or ensure anyone's safety. They moved with mechanical precision, breaking down doors without warning, dragging people out regardless of whether they were infected or not. It was brutal and efficient, like they were following orders without a shred of humanity. It wasn't like in the movies where soldiers announced themselves, knock and wait for a response. No, these guys weren't there to save anyone. They were armed with rifles, flamethrowers, and explosives, and they moved with brutal efficiency. If a house looked abandoned, they'd break in, sweep through every room, and mark it with an X. If they found anyone at all, they were dragged outside and taken to one of their quarantine zones. At first, people were hopeful. The soldiers promised safety, food, and medical care. They assured everyone that the infected were being handled and that anyone who showed no symptoms would be released after a thorough examination. But something didn't add up. People who were taken to the quarantine zones never came back. I noticed it first with the neighbors 2 doors down, the Petersons, a family of 4, mom, dad, and their 2 teenage sons. They were escorted out of the house one morning, looking scared, but relieved to be in the hands of the military. The dad even waved at me as they left. Days passed, and I didn't see them return. Then weeks. Their house stayed empty, boarded up like all the others. I started paying closer attention. Every person the soldiers took, whether they were sick or perfectly healthy, just vanished, never to be seen again. No one came back with food or supplies. No one returned with stories of the quarantine zone's safety. It became clear. The zones weren't sanctuaries. They were something else entirely. I made up my mind to avoid the military at all costs. Staying in my apartment wasn't an option anymore. The soldiers were sweeping through buildings, and the infected were growing bolder. So I packed my bag and started moving, sticking to the shadows and avoiding the main streets. Every time I heard the rumble of a military vehicle or the bark of an order through a megaphone, I ducked out of sight. The soldiers weren't subtle. They moved in convoys of armored trucks and Humvees, their floodlights cutting through the darkness. They set up checkpoints at major intersections, forcing survivors to line up for inspections. Anyone who didn't comply was shot on sight. The rest were loaded onto trucks and driven to the quarantine zones. I overheard whispers from other survivors, those lucky enough to stay hidden like me. They talked about experiments, about people being used as test subjects for a cure. The idea made my skin crawl. Were they dissecting people? Injecting them with the virus to study its effects? The thought of ending up on one of those tables was enough to keep me moving. One night, I stumbled upon a group of survivors hiding in an abandoned warehouse. There were about a dozen of them, ranging from kids to elderly folks. They had rigged up a decent shelter with tarps hanging from the rafters and a small stash of supplies. They let me stay the night, though they made it clear they didn't trust strangers. Fair enough. Among the group was a girl about my age named Ellie. She had short, dark hair and a sharp wit that made her seem older than she was. At first, she kept her distance, just like everyone else. But over time, we started talking. It was mostly small stuff at first. Where we had been when the outbreak started, who we had lost, what we missed most about the world before. She told me she had been in college when the outbreak hit, studying biology. Figures, she said with a bitter laugh. The one time knowing about fungi could have helped, and I was stuck in a dorm. We started working together on supply runs. Ellie was quick on her feet and good at spotting danger before it became a problem. One time, we were scavenging a convenience store when we heard the telltale sound of an infected. That low, guttural growl that made your skin crawl. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into the back room, holding a finger to her lips as we listened to it shuffle past. My heart was pounding, but Ellie stayed calm, her eyes scanning the room for another exit. When the coast was clear, she gave me a grin. "Stick with me, rookie. I'll keep you alive." I think that's when I started to like her. Over the weeks, Ellie and I grew closer. We'd sit up at night, talking quietly while the others slept. She told me about her little sister, who she hadn't seen since the outbreak started. I told her about my parents. "Maybe they made it," she said, her voice soft. Martin, one of the older survivors, became a central figure in the group. He was a grizzled, pragmatic man who had a knack for fixing things. According to him, his friend worked in logistics for the quarantine zones. "It's not what they're saying it is," Martin warned one night as we huddled around a makeshift heater. "People aren't being cared for or cured. They're being studied and tested on. My buddy said the soldiers get orders to round up anyone they can, sick or not, and once you're in, you don't come out." His words sent a chill through the group. A few people argued, saying he was just trying to scare us. But deep down, I think we all knew he was telling the truth. The zones weren't about saving people. They were about control. For a while, life in the warehouse felt almost stable. We had a system. Martin and a few others reinforced the barricades and set up traps around the perimeter. Ellie and I continued going on supply runs, each trip bringing back just enough to keep us going. There were arguments, of course. Some people thought we should move, find a safer place, maybe head for the countryside. Others insisted that going outside was right, that the warehouse was as good as it got. One night, the tension boiled over. A man named Kevin, one of the more vocal advocates for staying put, got into a shouting match with Sarah, a woman who wanted to leave. "You think it's bad here?" Kevin snapped. "Out there, it's a death sentence. You've seen what happens to the people the soldiers take. You want to walk into that?" "And what happens when the infected find us here?" Sarah shot back. "You think these barricades are gonna hold forever? We're sitting ducks." Ellie and I exchanged a glance. We'd been having the same debate in whispers late at night. She was leaning toward leaving, while I was more hesitant. The thought of wandering into the unknown with infected and soldiers around every corner terrified me, but staying put felt like a ticking time bomb. That night, Ellie and I snuck up the roof again. The city stretched out before us, dark and silent except for the occasional flicker of movement far below. "They're not wrong, you know," she said softly. "We can't stay here forever." "I know," I admitted. "But where do we go? What's even left out there?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I'd rather die trying than wait for it to come to us." A week later, the infected found us. It started with the low eerie groans echoing through the empty streets, followed by the sickly orange glow creeping along the edges of the warehouse. They came in waves, slamming against the barricades we'd set up. We fought back as best we could, but it was hopeless. There were too many of them, and they were too fast. The group scattered, some trying to fight, others running for any exit they could find. Ellie and I stuck together, racing through the maze of corridors. We made it to a small room near the back of the warehouse and slammed the door shut behind us. The infected were pounding on the other side, their growls growing louder by the second. The room had 2 windows, one in the bathroom and one in the living area. I ran to the living room window and yanked it open, motioning for Ellie to follow. "Come on!" I shouted, my voice shaking. She was right behind me, but as she reached the window, something grabbed her ankle. She screamed, her hands clawing at the frame as she tried to pull herself free. "Help me!" she cried, her voice desperate. I froze. Every instinct told me to help her, to grab her arms and pull her through. But my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by fear, by the sound of the infected closing in. I wanted to be a hero. I wanted to save her. But I wasn't brave enough. Ellie's eyes locked onto mine, a mix of fear and betrayal flashing across her face. "Please!" she screamed. I was angry at my own cowardice. I wanted to reach for her, to pull her through the window and prove to myself that I wasn't the kind of person who would abandon someone in their moment of need. But the weight of my own terror held me back. Her voice broke through again, louder this time, pleading. "Please, don't leave me." She reached for me, her fingers brushing against mine for the briefest moment. And then, she was pulled back, her screams ripping through the air like a jagged blade. I turned and leaped through the window, landing hard on the ground below. The impact sent a jolt of pain up my legs. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me, her cries grew fainter, swallowed by the growls and chaos. I ran into the darkness, and the image of her outstretched hand burned into my mind. The guilt was a weight I knew I'd carry for the rest of my life. The world blurred around me as I ran. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The warehouse and everything inside it, the chaos, the infected, Ellie's screams faded into the distance. My heart pounded like a war drum, pushing me forward, away from the horror I had just escaped. The night was cold, but sweat soaked through my clothes. Every shadow felt alive. Every noise was amplified. I didn't dare to look back. By the time I finally slowed, dawn was breaking over the horizon. I found myself on a desolate stretch of road leading out of town. The buildings thinned out until there was nothing left but empty fields on either side of me. The silence was almost as oppressive as the chaos I'd just fled. It wasn't comforting. It was the kind of silence that felt like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next tragedy to unfold. I collapsed on the side of the road, dropping my backpack and letting the cool morning air wash over me. My hands were trembling. Whether it was from exhaustion, fear, or guilt, I couldn't tell. I sat there for a long time, staring at the cracked asphalt beneath my feet. My mind replayed the scene over and over. Ellie's outstretched hand, her voice begging for help, the look in her eyes when I left her. I pressed my palms against my face, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The memory was burned into my mind. Eventually, I forced myself to move. Sitting there wasn't going to do me any good. I took inventory of what I had managed to grab before fleeing the warehouse. A few cans of food, a half-empty water bottle, a flashlight, a knife, and a first aid kit. It wasn't much. Definitely not enough to last more than a couple of days. I had to keep moving. I knew cities were a death trap. Every zombie movie and survival guide I'd ever consumed told me that. Too many people meant too many infected. Supplies might be easier to find in urban areas, but the risk wasn't worth it. My best bet was to stick to smaller towns, scavenging what I could and staying under the radar. The open road stretched before me, and I started walking, my legs heavy but unwilling to stop. The first few days were simple. I stuck to back roads and avoided main highways, keeping an eye out for anything that moved. I raided a gas station along the way, picking up a few bags of chips and a couple of bottles of water. The place had already been ransacked, shelves overturned, and glass shattered, but I managed to find a couple of overlooked items. The whole time, I kept my ears open for the low guttural growls of the infected. Every creak of a floorboard, every rustle of wind through the broken windows made my pulse spike. Nights were the worst. I couldn't risk a fire, so I slept in the cold, my knife clutched tightly in my hand. Every shadow outside my makeshift shelter, whether it was an abandoned car or a collapsed barn, felt like a threat. I dreamt of the warehouse, of Ellie, of her screams. I'd wake up in a panic, drenched in sweat, the guilt sitting like a stone in my stomach. After nearly a week of traveling, I found myself in a place that could barely be called a town. It was more of a cluster of houses and a single convenience store. The sign at the edge of the road had been worn down by time and weather, leaving the name of the place illegible. Most of the buildings were in various states of disrepair, but there was no sign of the infected. The silence was unnerving. I cautiously approached the convenience store, my knife in hand. The door was already ajar, hanging off one hinge, and the inside was a mess. Shelves were overturned, and the smell of rot lingered in the air. Still, I managed to find a couple of cans of beans and a bottle of soda. It wasn't much, but it would keep me going. As I stuffed the items into my backpack, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. "You planning to pay for that?" a voice said from behind me. I spun around, my knife raised, and came face to face with Martin. He looked rougher than I remembered, his beard longer, and his face lined with exhaustion. He was holding a shotgun, but it wasn't pointed at me. Instead, he leaned it casually against his shoulder, his expression wary, but not hostile. "Martin?" I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Figured it was you," he replied. "You've got the same deer-in-the-headlights look you had back at the warehouse." Seeing him was like a punch to the gut. Part of me was relieved to find someone familiar, but another part of me wanted to run. Martin had always been sharp and observant. He'd see right through me, see the guilt written all over my face. "What are you doing here?" I asked, lowering the knife, but keeping it in my hand. "Same as you, I'd guess. Looking for supplies. Trying to stay alive," he said. He gestured toward the door with his shotgun. "Let's get out of here. This place gives me the creeps." We walked in silence for a while, sticking to the side streets and alleys. Martin didn't ask about Ellie, and I didn't volunteer any information. The air between us was heavy, filled with unspoken words. Eventually, we found an abandoned house that looked sturdy enough to hole up in for the night. Martin took the first watch while I tried to get some sleep. The next morning, he finally brought it up, his voice quiet. "Ellie didn't make it, did she?" I shook my head, unable to meet his eyes. "No, she didn't." Martin didn't press me for details, but I could feel his judgment even if he didn't say it out loud. I didn't blame him. I judged myself just as harshly. Over the next few weeks, we traveled together. Martin was resourceful, and his military background gave him an edge when it came to survival. He taught me how to set traps, how to find safe places to sleep, and how to stay hidden. We avoided cities and stuck to rural areas, scavenging what we could from abandoned farms and roadside diners. But the world wasn't getting any safer. The infected were spreading, and the military's presence was becoming more oppressive. We saw convoys of trucks filled with survivors heading toward the quarantine zones, their faces blank with fear. Martin's warnings about the zones echoed in my head. Once you're in, you don't come out, and I believed him. One day, we came across a group of survivors hiding in an old church. They welcomed us cautiously, offering a place to rest and share a meal. Among them was a man who claimed to have escaped from one of the quarantine zones. His story was chilling. He described rows of cages, experiments that involved injecting people with the virus, and soldiers who treated the survivors like lab rats. "They're not trying to save anyone," he said, his voice shaking. "They're trying to understand the virus, to weaponize it. The news confirmed what Martin and I had suspected all along. The quarantine zones weren't sanctuaries. They were death traps. The only way to survive was to stay off the grid, to keep moving and avoid the military at all costs. But staying off the grid came with its own challenges. Supplies were running low, and every encounter with the infected was a gamble. The decision to leave the church was inevitable. Martin and I had spent countless nights sitting in the dim glow of our candlelight, discussing the growing dangers outside. The infected weren't the only threat anymore. Supplies were running low, and the barricades we had built felt more fragile with every passing day. The church, once a beacon of hope, now felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. "We can't stay here forever," Martin said one evening, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "The infected are getting bolder. It's only a matter of time before they break through." "I know," I replied, my mind racing with possibilities. "But where do we go? Walking out there is a death sentence, and we don't have the supplies to make it far on foot." Martin leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "We need a vehicle, something that can take us far from here, somewhere quiet, somewhere the infected haven't reached yet." I laughed bitterly. "And where exactly is that? The whole world's gone to hell. Every town, every city, it's all the same." "Not everywhere," Martin said, a hint of determination in his voice. "There's gotta be places where the infected haven't spread, places too remote or isolated. But we'll never get there without wheels." "Okay, let's say we find a vehicle. Where do we even start looking? Most of the cars around here are stripped or useless." Martin's eyes met mine, a spark of resolve igniting in his gaze. "The quarantine outpost." I stared at him, incredulous. "You're joking, right? That place is crawling with soldiers. They'd shoot us on sight if we got too close." "Not if we're smart about it," he said. "They have vehicles, supplies, everything we need to get out of here. It's risky, yeah, but it's our best shot." The idea was insane, but it also made a twisted kind of sense. The quarantine zone was a fortress, heavily guarded and stocked with everything the military needed to maintain control. If we could somehow get in and take what we needed, we might stand a chance at survival. "Alright," I said after a long pause. "Let's say we go for it. How the hell do we pull this off? We're two people against an entire outpost." Martin leaned back, his lips pressed into a thin line. "We'll have to scout it out first. Figure out their routines, their weak points. There's no way we're walking in blind. And once we're in, we find a vehicle, load it up with whatever supplies we can carry, and get out fast." It sounded simple when he said it, but I knew better. Nothing about this plan would be easy. The soldiers weren't just fighting the infected. They were fighting to maintain control in a world that had spiraled into chaos. If they caught us, we'd be as good as dead. "We'll need a distraction," I said, my mind already running through the possibilities. "Something to draw their attention away while we make our move." Martin nodded. "And we'll need to move fast. Once they realize what we're doing, it'll be a race to get out of there alive." The weight of the plan settled heavily between us, but there was no turning back. Staying in the church was a death sentence. And this, as crazy and dangerous as it was, felt like our only chance. "We'll start tomorrow," Martin said. "At first light, we'll head out and scout the outpost, see what we're up against." I nodded, a mixture of fear and determination swirling in my chest. Tomorrow. As I lay on the cold hard floor of the church that night, I couldn't help but think about everything that had led us to this point. The world was unrecognizable, a nightmare brought to life. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. It was faint and fragile, but it was enough to keep me going. The first day was about finding a safe spot. After hours of carefully navigating through back alleys and overgrown streets, we discovered an abandoned factory with a partially intact second floor that offered a clear view of the quarantine zone's perimeter. From there, we could see the tall fences topped with barbed wire, the floodlights that bathed the area in harsh brightness, and the soldiers patrolling the gates. "We need to figure out their routine," Martin whispered. "Every shift, every guard rotation, every weak spot." I clutched my binoculars tightly. I remember spending hours watching the soldiers move, noting the times when patrols shifted and when supply trucks entered and exited the compound. I understood pretty fast that this was no small operation. The quarantine zone was a fortress, its defenses tight. The soldiers worked in teams, always keeping an eye on one another, and the gates were manned around the clock. Our first day of surveillance was disappointing. "They're too organized," I muttered. "There's no obvious weak point." "We'll find one," Martin said with quiet determination. "We'll just have to keep watching." The next day, we returned to the factory at dawn. This time, we focused on the soldiers themselves. There were about 24, a mix of hardened veterans and younger recruits. The veterans moved with efficiency, but on the other hand, the younger soldiers, although disciplined, occasionally let their guard down, smoking their cigarettes during quiet moments or chatting when they thought no one was watching. "Bingo," I muttered under my breath. "The younger ones are the weak link. If we're going to create a distraction, it'll have to be during their shift," Martin noted. "Even if we manage to slip past them, how do we deal with the others?" I asked. "We'll figure it out," Martin said, though his tone betrayed his own uncertainty. "For now, we keep watching." By the third day, our supplies were running dangerously low. Meals consisted of stale crackers and sips of water, and our energy was waning. Still, we pressed on, returning to the factory at dawn and staying until dusk. My notebook was filled with information, patrol timings, gate activity, and any unusual occurrences. We noticed that supply trucks arrived every evening around 6 p.m., and their cargo was inspected by a team of soldiers before being allowed inside. This could be our opportunity, I said skeptical, waiting for Martin. "You're right," he agreed firmly. On the fourth day, we shifted our focus to the fences. The chain link barriers were reinforced with steel posts, and the barbed wire at the top would make climbing nearly impossible. However, there was a section near the western edge that seemed less heavily patrolled. The floodlights in that area flickered occasionally, suggesting a potential blind spot. "If we can time it right, we might be able to get through there," I suggested, though my voice lacked confidence. Martin shook his head. "Too risky. We'd be exposed for too long." "So what's the alternative? We can't just sit here and starve while we wait for the perfect opportunity." Martin placed a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. "We'll figure it out, but rushing in will only get us killed." By the fifth day, desperation was beginning to take its toll. We identified the key players among the soldiers. The commanding officers, a no-nonsense woman who rarely left the central building, the supply officer who seemed to oversee the truck inspections, and the younger recruits who often worked the night shifts. But knowing who we were up against didn't make the task any less daunting. "We need a distraction," Martin said that evening as we huddled in the factory, our voices low to avoid attracting attention. "Something big enough to draw most of the soldiers away from the gates." "Like what? We don't have explosives or anything like that." Martin thought for a moment, then said, "Fire." "Fire? If we can set something ablaze near the eastern perimeter, it might force them to divert their attention. And while they're distracted, we make our move?" I asked. "Exactly," Martin replied. The sixth day was mostly spent collecting the tools for the operations. Anything we could find worked. That night, as we sat in the factory, the weight of what we were about to do was consuming me. "What if it doesn't work?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "It has to," Martin replied. "We don't have a choice." By the seventh day, our food was gone. My stomach growled constantly, and Martin's movements had become sluggish. We couldn't afford to wait any longer. As we prepared to leave the factory for what could be the last time, I was afraid. "Are we really doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. Martin nodded, his expression grim. "We don't have a choice." As we silently approached the quarantine zone through the shadows, I could feel my heart pounding. The plan was simple but dangerous. Set the shed on fire, use the chaos to slip through the western blind spot, and make our way to the vehicle lot. But even the best laid plans could go horribly wrong. I've seen it too many times in movies. Everything started smoothly. We crept through the tall grass. Just like we had planned, the shift change happened exactly on schedule, and the distraction worked like a charm. As the soldiers hurried toward the shed, Martin and I made our move, slipping through the shadows toward the vehicles. Once the area cleared enough, Martin rushed for the vehicles, while I headed for the small guardhouse. The keys had to be inside. I rushed in, panic rising in my chest. When I spotted the keys, I grabbed them, but before I could turn back, I heard the sharp click of a gun behind me. "Hands where I can see 'em!" A soldier screamed at me. I froze, trembling. Was this it? Before I could react, I saw Martin strike the soldier down, his axe burying itself in the man's head, killing him instantly. The soldier fired a few shots, one of them catching me in the leg. The gunfire drew the attention of more soldiers. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Martin and I ran for one of the vehicles. But my wound slowed me down. It hurt so much. I lagged behind, and the soldiers quickly closed the gap, opening fire, making escape impossible. Martin fired back, but it was clear we were outgunned and outnumbered. The soldiers kept advancing. I remember Martin looking at me as I frantically tried to patch up my leg. "Hey kid, survive." With that, Martin turned and sprinted away from the vehicle, using the last of his ammunition to fight back. Soldiers chased after him, but some stayed behind, aware of my position. I quickly climbed into the vehicle and started the engine. With the opening Martin had given me, I couldn't afford to hesitate. Slamming the pedal to the floor, I drove forward, forcing soldiers to leap out of the way. I smashed through the gates, barely making it, and sped off into the distance, tears streaming down my face. The road stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through a landscape of desolation. I didn't dare look back. The rearview mirror reflected only darkness and the faint glow of the quarantine zone receding behind me. My hands were trembling as they gripped the wheel, and every bump in the road sent a fresh jolt of pain through my injured leg. Blood soaked the makeshift bandage I'd wrapped around it. Just a torn strip of my shirt, and the coppery smell filled the air inside the vehicle. The vehicle's headlights illuminated the eerie abandoned world ahead. Burnt-out cars lined the roadside, their frames rusted and skeletal, like ghosts of a life that had long since crumbled. Buildings with shattered windows stood silent, their interiors swallowed by shadows. Occasionally, I spotted signs of the infected, smears of dried blood on walls, a single shoe abandoned in the middle of the road, or worse, the faint shuffling of figures in the distance. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I drove for hours, maybe days. Time had lost all meaning, blending into the monotony of my escape. The further I got, the quieter the world became. No gunfire, no screams, no growls. Just the hum of the engine and the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. The silence was almost worse than the chaos. I felt alone. Once in the countryside, fields stretched out endlessly on either side of the road. The horizon was painted in shades of gold and green, broken only by the occasional silhouette of a lone tree or a dilapidated farmhouse. It was beautiful in a way. The supplies Martin and I had gathered during the heist had lasted me well, giving me enough food, water and fuel to keep going. But even with the stockpile, the weight of survival pressed heavily on me. I knew I couldn't rely on luck forever. The infected might be far behind me now, but they always seemed to find a way to catch up. And there were other dangers. Bandits, starvation, my own exhaustion. As night began to fall, I stumbled upon a massive wheat field. The golden stalks swayed gently in the breeze, their tops catching the fading light and creating an almost ethereal glow. I parked the vehicle and stepped into the field, the wheat brushing against my arms as I pushed through. The sound of the stalks rustling was strangely soothing, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe. The field seemed to stretch on endlessly, a sea of gold beneath the dark sky. I found a small rise near the center of the field. I returned to my vehicle and parked it there, leaving it hidden amongst the tall wheat. The stars began to emerge as the sky darkened, their light piercing through the vast emptiness above. It was beautiful and haunting all at once. I reached into my backpack and pulled out a meal bar and some water. Rationing had become second nature, but for once, I ate and drank freely, knowing I had enough supplies to last a little while longer. As I ate, my mind wandered back to Martin. His face, his voice, his last words. The guilt was a constant weight on my chest, heavier than anything I'd ever carried. He'd saved me, given me a chance to survive, and I'd repaid him by driving away. I could still see him in my mind, standing there as the soldiers closed in, buying me time to escape. Survive, he'd said. But surviving felt like a hollow victory. I stared out at the field, the wheat bending and swaying like waves in the ocean. In the distance, I thought I saw movement. Just a flicker. A shadow. My hand instinctively went to the knife at my side, the only weapon I had left. But after a few moments of watching, the shadow disappeared, and I convinced myself it had been my imagination. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. The night passed slowly. I didn't dare sleep. The risk was too great. Instead, I sat there, watching the stars and listening to the wind rustling through the wheat. Every sound made my heart race. The distant hoot of an owl, the creak of the tree trunk I leaned against, the faint rustle of something moving through the field. I clutched my knife tightly, ready to defend myself if the infected or anything else appeared. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of lavender and gold, I forced myself to my feet. My leg protested with a sharp stab of pain, but I gritted my teeth and pushed through it. I couldn't stay here. The field might have felt safe for a moment, but I knew better. Nowhere was truly safe anymore. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and began walking again, using the sun to guide me east. The wheat field stretched on for miles, and the quiet was almost maddening. But as I trudged through the stalks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd stop and listen, straining to hear anything over the sound of my own labored breathing. But there was nothing, just the wind and the whisper of the wheat. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the field that I realized how wrong I'd been. There, in the distance, was a figure, not shuffling like the infected, but standing still, watching me. My grip tightened on the knife as I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking with a mix of fear and hope. The figure didn't move at first, but then they raised a hand, a gesture of peace. As they stepped closer, I could see it was a woman, her face gaunt and tired, but human. She carried a rifle slung over her shoulder and a pack much like mine. When she was close enough, she stopped, keeping a cautious distance. "You're alone?" she asked, her voice wary. I nodded, too stunned to say anything. She studied me for a moment, her eyes scanning from head to toe. "You look like you could use some help." I wanted to cry, to collapse right there and beg her for assistance. But instead, I nodded again, forcing myself to stand tall. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, I could." She stepped a little closer, her hands still raised slightly, showing she meant no harm. "You don't look like you've slept in days," she said, her tone softer now. "And that leg, you're hurt." "I'm fine," I replied quickly, though it was an obvious lie. My leg throbbed with every step, and the exhaustion weighed on me like a heavy chain. "I've been through worse." She raised an eyebrow, not buying it. "What's your name?" "Liam," I said after a pause. "Yours?" "Emma," she replied. Her gaze flicked to the wheat field behind me, as if scanning for signs of danger. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here," I admitted. "I've been driving for days, just trying to stay ahead of everything." Emma nodded knowingly. "The infected and the soldiers," I added. Her expression darkened slightly at that, and I could tell she understood exactly what I meant. "You've got a vehicle?" she asked, glancing past me toward the field. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, it's hidden back there." For the first time, a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Smart. Most people would have parked right out in the open. I'm not most people, I said, though the words felt hollow. Surviving this long didn't make me special, just lucky. And luck runs out. Emma shifted her weight, clearly debating something in her head. Finally, she said, Look, I've been on my own for a while now. Traveling is easier with 2 people. Safer too. If you're heading somewhere, maybe we can go together? I studied her face, trying to read her intentions. She looked as tired and desperate as I felt, but there was a steadiness in her eyes, a determination that hadn't been completely snuffed out by this nightmare of a world. Yeah, I said, surprising even myself with how quickly I agreed. We can stick together. We made our way back to the vehicle, moving cautiously through the wheat. Emma had a sharpness about her, constantly scanning our surroundings for threats. When we reached the vehicle, she let out a low whistle. You really came out of the quarantine zone with this thing? It wasn't exactly smooth, I said, trying to keep my voice even. The memories of Martin's sacrifice were still too raw. But yeah, I did. Emma glanced at me, probably sensing there was more to the story, but she didn't push. Instead, she climbed into the passenger seat, setting her rifle across her lap. Let's go then. The longer we stay in one place, the more likely something finds us. I nodded, starting the engine. The vehicle rumbled to life, and for a brief moment, I felt a slicker of safety. We drove east, following the rising sun. We went past fields, forests, the occasional crumbling house or barn. It was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt unnatural. Emma and I didn't talk much at first. The weight of survival hung between us, heavy and unspoken. But as the miles stretched on, the silence became unbearable. So, I said, breaking it, how'd you manage to stay alive out here? Emma glanced at me, a small smirk playing on her lips. I'm resourceful. Grew up hunting with my dad, so I know how to handle a rifle, and I don't trust anyone easily, which helps. I nodded, gripping the wheel tighter. Smart. What about you? She asked, leaning back against the seat. You look like you've been through hell. I let out a bitter laugh. You could say that. I had someone with me, a friend. We were trying to survive together. But my voice trailed off, and I shook my head, unable to finish the sentence. Emma didn't press me. Instead, she looked out the window, her expression somber. Everyone's lost someone. We drove in silence for a little while after that, the conversation hanging heavy between us. But as the sun climbed higher, warming the world around us, the mood began to shift. Emma started pointing out little things, a hawk circling in the distance, a cluster of wildflowers growing along the roadside. It was the first time in weeks that I noticed anything other than the constant threat of death. Hours later, my phone buzzed. The sound startled me so much I nearly slammed on the brakes. I pulled the phone from my pocket, staring at the screen in disbelief. Notifications. Dozens of them. I had a signal. What the hell? Emma muttered, pulling out her own phone. She had the same look of shock on her face. I haven't had a signal in months. We pulled off the road, parking near a cluster of trees. For the first time in what felt like forever, I opened my messages, my social media, my email. Most of the notifications were old, months-old messages and news alerts that had been waiting to come through. But a few were new. One caught my eye. Emergency broadcast. UN coalition deploys aid to unaffected zones. Holy shit, I whispered, reading the headline. What is it? Emma asked, leaning over to look at my screen. I showed her the message. Her eyes widened. You think it's real? Aid? That could mean other places are still functioning. Maybe, I said, my voice tinged with hope and doubt in equal measure. Or it could just be false hope, propaganda to keep people calm. Emma frowned, but didn't argue. Instead, she scrolled through her own phone, reading whatever she could find. It says some areas in Europe and Asia are still holding strong. Fortified zones. Minimal outbreaks. Maybe it's not as bad everywhere. The thought was almost too much to process. For so long, survival had been my only focus. The idea that there still might be places where life continued, where people wasn't trying to just stay alive, but actually living, it felt impossible. But if there was even a chance, it was worth finding out. "What do you think?" Emma asked, her voice quiet. "Do we head toward one of these zones? Try to find somewhere safe?" I stared at the screen, the notification blinking like tiny beacons of hope. For the first time in a long time, I felt something other than fear or despair. I felt possibility. "Yeah," I finally said, my voice firm. "We go." And just like that, the horizon didn't seem so empty anymore. Emma and I sat in the vehicle for what felt like hours, the screen of my phone glowing in the dim light as we scrolled through article after article, notification after notification. The initial spark of hope I had quickly began to dim. With every line I read, that hope shriveled up, replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. Our country was quarantined, completely sealed off from the rest of the world. Borders closed, no flights, no ships, no way in or out. The emergency measures had been put into place months ago, but the details were only now filtering through. The reason was simple and brutal. The infection was too widespread here. The rest of the world had decided we were a lost cause. Until every single infected was eradicated, no one was coming to help. I stared at the words, unable to process them. My hands were trembling, and I felt the bile rising in my throat. "No way in, no way out," the phrase looped in my head. Emma leaned over, her face pale as she read over my shoulder. "Liam, this can't be right. They can't just leave us here to die." "But they have," I said, my voice hollow. My throat felt tight, like I was being strangled by the weight of the truth. "We're on our own." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence in the vehicle was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. My hands clenched around the phone, the plastic case creaking under the pressure. All that hope, all those dreams of finding a safe haven somewhere beyond this nightmare were crushed in an instant. The realization was suffocating. Emma eventually broke the silence. "We need to keep moving, find somewhere safe where we can think this through." I nodded numbly, shoving the phone back in my pocket. My chest felt heavy. Someone had strapped a boulder to it. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life. The sound was a small comfort, a reminder that at least the vehicle still worked. We pulled back onto the road, heading east once more. Emma tried to make small talk a few times, asking about my life before everything went to hell, but I could barely respond. My thoughts were a jumbled mess, swirling with images of Martin's sacrifice, the warehouse, and now the knowledge that there was no escape. My sanity felt like it was hanging by a thread. The scenery outside began to change again, the flat fields giving way to rolling hills and patches of dense forest. The sky was overcast, casting everything in a dull grey light that only added to the oppressive atmosphere. Every so often, I'd spot a cluster of abandoned vehicles on the side of the road, or a burnt-out farmhouse in the distance, signs of life that had been snuffed out long ago. Emma's voice pulled me out of my thoughts. "We should find somewhere to stop soon." I glanced at the fuel gauge. We still had plenty, thanks to the stockpile from the quarantine zone. But I knew she wasn't talking about gas. She was talking about shelter. Somewhere to rest, to regroup. "Yeah," I said quietly. My voice sounded foreign to me, distant and detached. "Let's keep an eye out." It took another couple of hours before we found a place that seemed suitable. It was an old rest stop tucked off the side of a long-forgotten highway. The building was small and weathered, the paint peeling off its walls, but it looked intact. More importantly, it looked empty. We parked the vehicle behind the building, hidden from the road, and approached cautiously. Emma took the lead, her rifle at the ready, while I limped along behind her with my knife in hand. My leg was still a mess, but the bleeding had stopped, and I could move a little better now. The rest stop was quiet, too quiet. Every creak of the floorboards under our feet set my nerves on edge. Emma methodically cleared each room, her movements precise and practiced. It was clear she'd done this sort of thing before. By the time she gave the all clear, my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my knife. "It's safe," she said, lowering her rifle. "At least for now." We set up camp inside, barricading the doors and windows as best we could. The supplies from the vehicle were brought inside, and we took stock of what we had: food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, enough to last us a little while, but not forever. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, Emma lit a small lantern she'd found in one of the cabinets. The warm light filled the space, pushing back the darkness and making it feel just a little less oppressive. That night, we sat across from each other on the floor, sharing a can of soup. The silence between us was heavy, but not uncomfortable. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel completely alone. "So," Emma said, breaking the silence, "what did you do before all this?" I hesitated, unsure if I even remembered anymore. "I was a student," I said finally. "College, studying engineering, but I dropped out." "Oh," she answered. "And you?" I asked. Her expression grew distant, like she was hiding something. "I'm sorry if it's a sensitive." I tried to apologize, but I was cut short by her voice again. "It's nothing. I don't like talking about the past," she added. I didn't blame her. Emma shrugged, poking at her soup with a spoon. "I wanted a normal life, I guess. Funny how that worked out." The next morning, we decided to move again. The rest stop was safe for now, but it was too exposed, too close to the road. We needed somewhere more secluded, somewhere we could stay longer without constantly looking over our shoulders. We packed up the supplies and loaded them back into the vehicle. My leg protested with every step, but I gritted my teeth and pushed through the pain. Emma offered to drive, and I didn't argue. My mind was too foggy to focus on the road anyway. As we drove, Emma's phone buzzed again. She pulled it out, her eyes scanning the screen. "Still have a signal," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "Barely, but it's there." "Good," I said, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. The signal felt like a lifeline, but it also felt like a cruel joke. What good was staying connected if the rest of the world had written us off? We drove for hours, stopping occasionally to check our surroundings or stretch our legs. The landscape grew wilder as we moved further from civilization, with dense forests and rocky hills replacing the open fields. By the time the sun began to set, we found a small cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was old and weathered, but it looked sturdy. More importantly, it was isolated, the perfect place to disappear for a while. As we unpacked the vehicle and settled in, I couldn't shake the gnawing sense of despair that had taken root in my chest. No matter how far we ran, no matter how well we hid, the truth was we were trapped. That first day, we worked in silence. Emma was the one who took charge. She used this beat-up toolkit we'd found earlier to nail planks across the windows, while I went out and gathered stones to block the door. Not exactly Fort Knox, but enough to make us feel a little safer. By the second day, the cabin started to feel like a place where we could maybe survive. I found this old, ratty blanket in a closet and threw it over the mattress to make it less disgusting. Emma rigged up a clothesline near the stove to dry our wet gear. We even found a little transistor radio on a shelf. It didn't pick up anything but static, but I kept it on anyways. That faint buzz was better than the silence. On the third day, I woke up earlier to check the area for firewood, making sure there weren't any infected or other survivors snooping around. Emma stayed back and organized our supplies. She was good at it too. I watched her stack cans, arrange medical kits, make everything fit perfectly into this tiny corner of the cabin. I didn't say it out loud, but it was comforting. Like as long as she was here, there was some order to things. But nights were the hardest. I'd lie there on that damp, uncomfortable mattress, staring at the ceiling, and my mind would just unravel. I'd think about everything I'd lost. And then, inevitably, I'd think about Emma. Her laugh, her determination, her optimism. It should have made me feel better, but instead, It felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. I didn't know why. Maybe I envied her, or maybe I just didn't trust it. Then came the 4th day. That was the day everything changed. We were out gathering firewood when Emma spotted it. An old truck, half hidden under a mass of overgrown bushes. The paint was peeling, and it looked like it hadn't been touched in a while. Emma practically bolted toward it, her face lighting up like a kid on Christmas morning. I hung back, scanning the area for any signs of danger. Old habits die hard. When she pried open the back doors, I'll never forget the sound she made. A little gasp, half disbelief, half joy. Inside, there were crates of canned food, bottled water, duct tape, medical supplies, even a couple of weapons. There were blankets and clothes too, and this dusty carton of instant coffee that made Emma laugh out loud. It was the first time I'd seen her smile like that in days. "Can you believe this?" she said, her voice breathless as she rummaged through the supplies. "It's like we hit the jackpot." I let myself smile, just a little. For the first time in a long time, I felt normal. We spent the rest of the afternoon unloading the truck and hauling everything back to the cabin. It took hours, but it didn't matter. We had supplies to last us weeks, maybe even months. We had a roof over our heads. We were far away from the infected. And for once, I wasn't completely alone. By the time we got everything inside, the sun was setting and the sky was this incredible mix of orange and pink. Emma was humming some tune I didn't recognize as she stacked cans in neat little rows. I leaned against the wall and just watched her. She seemed so happy, so at ease. It was contagious. "Everything's gonna be okay," she said, catching my eye. "We've got this, Liam." I nodded, but I couldn't shake this feeling in my gut. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something inside me was screaming that it wasn't that simple. It's never that simple. That night, we ate instant soup by the stove and sipped on the first hot coffee I'd had in months. For a little while, it felt like we weren't just surviving. We were living. Once I laid down on that mattress later that night, all those dark thoughts didn't come back, and I could finally sleep peacefully. The 5th day began like most of the others. Emma and I spent the morning sorting through our supplies, a routine that had become strangely comforting. She was always meticulous, labeling cans and organizing the first aid kit while I busied myself reinforcing the barricades. The cabin felt more secure than ever, but the sense of unease lingered. I told myself it was just the world we lived in now, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. But that fleeting moment of peace didn't last. That evening, as we sat by the stove, I noticed something off. My phone, which had been buzzing intermittently with weak signals, was completely silent. No notifications, no messages, nothing. "The signal's gone," I muttered, holding up the device. Emma glanced over, her expression unreadable. "Figures, nothing lasts forever, right?" She was trying to play it cool, but I could tell she was disappointed. The signal had been a lifeline, a reminder that we weren't completely cut off from the world. But I'd been through this before. Ever since the outbreak started, things had a way of disappearing just when you got used to them. "We'll manage," I said, more for her sake than mine. That night, I fell asleep to the sound of the wind rattling the cabin walls. The fire in the stove crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across the room. For the first time in a while, I felt almost content. But that feeling didn't last. I woke to the sound of something clattering to the floor. My heart jumped into my throat as I sat up, scanning the dimly lit room. My vehicle keys glinted on the floor near the door. That's when I saw her. Emma was standing by the door, a bag slung over her shoulder and a rifle in her hand. My blood ran cold as the realization hit me. She was trying to leave. No, she wasn't just leaving. She was taking the supplies, the vehicle, everything Martin and I had fought for. "Emma," I said, my voice hoarse. She froze, turning to face me, her eyes wide, her face pale. "Liam? It's not what it looks like." "Really?" I stood, my legs shaky. because it looks like you're trying to steal everything and leave me here to die." "It's not like that," she insisted, her voice trembling. I was going to come back. I swear." "Come back? You expect me to believe that, after everything we've been through?" I said harshly. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and yanked the door open. The cold night air rushed in as she stepped outside, but I wasn't going to let her go that easily. I lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her back into the cabin. The bag fell to the floor, supplies spilling out across the room. "Let me go!" she shouted, struggling against me. "You're not leaving!" I yelled, my grip tightening. The fight was chaotic. She shoved me into the wall, and I stumbled, knocking over a chair. I grabbed her again, this time pinning her against the table. Her eyes were wild, filled with a mix of fear and determination. She reached for the rifle slung over her shoulder, but I was faster. I grabbed it, pointing it at her before she could react. "Liam?" she said, her voice shaking. "Please, put the gun down. We can talk about this." I stared at her, my hands trembling. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, betrayal, fear. But above all, one thought echoed louder than the rest. I had to survive, at any cost. "I trusted you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "And this is what you do?" I was scared," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I thought if I could get away, save it," I snapped, cutting her off. She took a step toward me, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Liam, you don't have to do this. Please." But I knew how this ended. I'd seen enough movies, read enough stories. The people who gave second chances always paid for it in the end. I couldn't afford that. Not now. Not ever. My finger tightened on the trigger. She saw it in my eyes, the moment I made my decision. "Liam, don't!" The gunshot echoed through the cabin, deafening in the confined space. Emma crumpled to the floor, her eyes wide with shock. The realization of what I'd done hit me like a freight train. I staggered back, dropping the rifle as bile rose in my throat. My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, staring at her lifeless body. I killed her. I killed a person before I ever killed an infected. The weight of it was suffocating. I crawled to the corner of the room, my head in my hands as I tried to process what I'd just done. Emma's blood pooled on the floor, stark against the wooden boards. I'm sorry," I whispered, though there was no one left to hear it. The cabin felt colder than ever. The silence was deafening, broken only by my ragged breaths. I had survived, but at what cost? 4 days. It had been 4 days since Emma's body lay motionless on the cabin floor, and I still hadn't buried her. Every time I thought about digging a hole, I froze. It wasn't guilt, not entirely. It was fear. Fear that the sound of the shovel hitting the dirt would echo too loudly in the stillness. Fear that some infected, or worse, some person would hear and come for me. So I left her there, in the cabin we'd called home for those fleeting days of false hope. I took everything, the supplies, the weapons, the vehicle keys, and ran. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The cabin was a chapter I had to close, just like everything else. The road stretched out before me like a scar on the earth, winding through forests and fields, each mile pulling me further from the cabin and deeper into isolation. The supplies Emma and I had gathered felt heavier than they should have, like they carried the weight of what I'd done. The vehicle was my lifeline now, a metal cocoon that shielded me from the horrors of the world outside. I drove aimlessly, the hum of the engine my only companion, until the fuel gauge dipped low enough to make me nervous. I couldn't stay on the move forever. I needed a place to settle, at least for a while. Somewhere safe, somewhere quiet. The infected weren't the only danger. Humans were just as unpredictable, and I couldn't afford another confrontation. Not after Emma. Eventually, I found it. A house, tucked away at the end of a long dirt road, surrounded by overgrown bushes and tall trees. It looked abandoned, the windows dark and the paint peeling from the walls. But I couldn't take any chances. The first rule of survival is to never assume. Just because a place looks empty doesn't mean it is. I parked the vehicle a good distance away and approached on foot, keeping low and quiet. The door was locked, but the windows weren't. I slipped inside, weapon in hand, and began to clear the house room by room. The living room was empty. There was a couch covered in dust and a coffee table stacked with old magazines. The kitchen was the same, dishes still in the sink, cupboards hanging open, but no signs of life. I moved through the hallways, checking every closet and corner. Every creak of the floorboards made my heart race, but I pressed on. The final room was upstairs, at the end of the hall. The door was closed, and something about it made my stomach churn. I tightened my grip on the weapon and pushed it open, bracing myself for whatever I might find. The smell hit me first, the sickly, unmistakable stench of decay. Then I saw him. A man slumped against the far wall, a pistol still clutched in his skeletal hand. The blood stain on the wall behind him told me everything I needed to know. He'd probably been dead for weeks, maybe months, long enough for the body to decompose, but not long enough for the sight of him to lose its impact. He was about my age. That's what struck me the hardest. His clothes, his build, even the way his hair was styled. It was like looking at a warped reflection of myself. I stared at him for what felt like an eternity, unable to move. This was where the road ended for people like us, wasn't it? Alone in some forgotten corner of the world, with nothing but a gun and the echoes of our own thoughts for company. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Not until I noticed the laptop sitting on the desk behind him. Unlike the rest of the room, it was clean, untouched by dust, and the light on its side was blinking. It had power, and there was a signal somehow, even though my phone hadn't picked up any. I didn't touch the body. I couldn't bring myself to. Instead, I grabbed the laptop and carried it downstairs. The house was empty now, and it would do for shelter. I barricaded the doors and windows as best I could and set up camp in the living room. The supplies I'd taken from the cabin filled the cupboards, but the laptop called to me. It sat on the coffee table, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. I powered it on and waited as it booted up. The connection was weak, but functional. What I found was a blank text document, left open on the screen, a cursor blinking expectantly, like it was waiting for me to write. But I had nothing else to do, nothing left but to write. So I did. I started typing. To whom? I had no idea. Maybe my story can help someone out there, help them learn from my mistakes, or maybe just offer me the hope of connecting with someone, even if it's from a distance, without the risk of betrayal or loss. So, if you're reading this, maybe you're out there, somewhere, fighting your own battles. Maybe you're surviving too, against all odds. If that's the case, then here's the only advice I can offer. Survive. No matter the cost. No matter what it takes.